I recently remembered something strange that happened to me a while ago. When I was around 8 or 9, my parents sent me to a sleepaway camp for a couple weeks. Unlike other camps I'd been to, this one scared me so much I had to come home early and ended up sleeping in my parents' bed for 6 weeks. The camp was huge, set in the mountains and really isolated. The boys' cabin was right behind the outdoor horse stables, which didn't have actual stalls. Instead, the horses were tied up in a big field behind our cabin, and there was a sloped dirt hill between the cabin and the fence where the horses were tied. On one of the nights, there was a storm coming. However, some of us were too excited to go to sleep, so me and few boys decided to explore. We found ourselves at the stables. The horses were pulling at their ropes and snorting, I think in anticipation of the storm. We whispered and dared each other to get closer to the nervous animals. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning lit up the field, and for a split second, we saw a figure standing on the hill. It was a girl, maybe 7 or 8. We all just froze, staring in disbelief, but when the light faded, she was gone. We all ran back to our cabin, but ended up just teasing each other about how scared we looked. Looking back, this should have been the sign to stay away. The next day, about 6 of us boys decided to throw pebbles at the girls' cabin. We used the path behind our cabin to sneak around without getting caught by our counselor. We played this game until we were exhausted from running back and forth. On our final run through the alley below the horse fence, we saw a young girl sitting on top of the fence. She was level with the roof of our cabin. Someone from our group called out to ask which cabin she was in. The girl just started swinging on the fence, and we were all puzzled because we didn't recognize her from any of the meals or activities. Another boy yelled, asking if she even belonged at the camp. Suddenly, she looked behind her as if a horse was approaching. We couldn't see anything past the fence. In an instant, the girl was thrown from the fence. She began rolling down the hill in a twisted, contorted way, landing about 5 feet in front of the first boy in our group. We screamed in terror and ran to get our counselor. When he came back with us, the girl was gone. We were just a group of young boys no older than 10, and we were all terrified. Our counselor was angry at first, but there were too many of us to ignore. We all wanted to go home immediately, some of the boys throwing tantrums to get their parents on the phone. The camp manager tried to convince us to stay and have fun for the rest of the week, but most of us were adamant about going home. The manager then told us about the camp's history. Before it was a camp, it was mainly a horse ranch. A rancher's daughter used to feed the horses daily. One day, while sitting on the railing, a horse scared her from behind, and she fell down the hill, breaking many bones and dying. A few kids were able to immediately get picked up, but a handful of us were stuck. That night back in our cabin, we couldn't sleep. The image of the girl kept us awake. What made it worse was the sound of hooves coming from the stable. When one of the boys peeked out the window, he saw a horse standing alone in the field, staring at our cabin. There was no rider, but it felt like the horse was watching us. We all huddled together, too scared to move or speak. My parents picked me up first thing in the morning, and the car ride home was silent. When I brought this up to my mom recently, she was shocked. She told me the camp manager had called her that night, saying there had been a big fight and that I and some boys were harassing other campers. But to us, it was a terrifying and real experience. Right before I turned 15, I was sent to a sleepaway camp, literally in the middle of nowhere. It was surrounded by dense forest, with the city being miles away. There were about 30 of us teenagers and a few camp leaders. Our cabin had 2 floors, with the girls' bedrooms on the 2nd floor. We were settling down to sleep around midnight, when suddenly there was a really loud bang on the only window we had. Since it was dark outside, we really couldn't see what, or rather who it was. That was when a flashlight beam cut through from the outside, and we saw 2 men, probably in their 30s, lurking and smiling at us. Our screams brought the camp leaders running, and they called the police. But by the time the authorities arrived, the men had vanished into the woods. Luckily, the window couldn't be opened and was too small for anyone to fit through. The next morning, we were discussing the incident, and we learned that one of the girls at camp had been in some kind of relationship with one of the men and had invited them. Quite illegal, to say the least. The police questioned the men, but couldn't charge them with anything significant. The police told the counselors that they didn't do anything illegal enough to get arrested. It was just so creepy to wake up and find grown men watching us sleep, especially from the 2nd floor. Over the next few days, the camp leaders tried to assure us that everything was fine, and that the police would be keeping an eye on the area, but the incident had us all on edge. At night, every little noise was amplified. One night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to a crunching sound coming from outside. It was like the sound of footsteps approaching our cabin. My heart started racing, and when I turned to look, there was nothing there. It seemed like the footsteps had stopped right beneath our window, and I never heard them leave. I tried to convince myself that I was just hearing things. Somehow, I had fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember was being woken up the next morning. All the girls, myself included, were unable to fully enjoy our time there, and the camp leaders took notice. That evening, they decided to have a campfire to try and lift our spirits. We gathered around the fire to roast marshmallows and to just be in each other's company. It was actually kind of fun, and for a while, we managed to forget about what happened. But then, we heard some rustling coming from the woods. The leaders shined their lights toward the sound, and that's when we caught a glimpse of a figure ducking behind a tree. We panicked, realizing that it could be the men again. The camp leaders quickly put out the fire and rushed us back into the cabins. The police were called again, but like before, the men were nowhere to be found. At this point, even the camp leaders were at a loss. The camp director decided to end things early after hearing everything that went down. Our parents were called to come pick us up, and we couldn't have been happier. As I left, though, I just couldn't shake the feeling that we had been watched the whole time. Even now, years later, I still get chills thinking about those men and what they might have been planning. The camp has since closed down, and I've never gone back to that area, but I think the memory of that summer will always haunt me. When I was 14, I went to a summer camp for a week. When I first got there, everything was okay. It wasn't the best, but it was manageable, you know? Halfway through the week, 3 girls from my cabin, let's call them Lucy, Hannah, and Chloe, suggested playing with an ouija board in the middle of the woods. Me, being a naive 14-year-old, was just like, yeah, let's do it. So we made a plan to sneak out of the cabin at 2:30 that night with our maps and flashlights, because we weren't allowed to have phones. When it was 2:30, we made sure no one was up to hear us leave, and we started heading to our secret spot. We reached the center of the woods around the campsite, just far enough not to be heard by anyone but close enough to find our way back. Once there, we set up the ouija board and turned on our flashlights. Lucy taunted us saying, "Are you guys ready, or are you gonna chicken out?" We all laughed and assured her we were ready, so we began. At first, nothing happened, and it seemed like a silly game. But then the piece actually started moving. I thought one of the girls was messing with us, but when we started asking questions like, "How old are you? Where are you from? How are you? And are you friendly?" the answers felt real. It was all fun until the girls started making jokes. The spirit seemed to get angry, and I was getting worried about the jokes the others were making. I suggested we wrap it up and get back before everyone wakes up. It was almost 4 a.m. at this point, and everyone is supposed to wake up around 5 or 5:30. The others just laughed at me, and Hannah teased me saying, "I knew you'd be the one to chicken out." But I ignored her, insisting we end the game, and they finally agreed. We thought we ended it correctly, but now I'm not so sure. Chloe and I started walking back to the campsite because it was almost daylight, but for some reason, Hannah and Lucy decided to stay and play hide and seek. I thought to myself how stupid that was, especially since they didn't know what was out in those woods. But Chloe and I headed back, got into our bunks, and went to sleep. The next morning, our counselor, I'll call her Mary, woke us up and noticed Hannah was missing. She asked if any of us knew where she was, and we all said no. Mary looked worried, so I glanced at Chloe, who glanced at Lucy. Lucy looked back at both of us, clearly scared. Apparently Lucy couldn't find Hannah one round, so she assumed Hannah had come back to the cabin and went to bed like us. Counselor Mary checked the bathroom, and after not finding her there, she called the camp leader. The camp leader searched for over an hour and eventually found Hannah sitting by the old treehouse. She seemed unnaturally happy, almost like in a daze. Her smile made me seriously uncomfortable. Mary rushed to her, shaking her gently, but Hannah just continued to smile without saying a word. At this point, the rest of the campers had started gathering around. The camp leader eventually decided to take Hannah to the infirmary. We were all told to go back to our activities, but none of us could realistically focus on anything else. What happened the night before kept replaying in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had done something wrong when we ended the game. After lunch, we did find the camp leader and decided to tell her what happened in the woods. We told her everything, from sneaking out, to the game, to the girls staying behind. She didn't know what to make of it, but she did take us seriously considering what was happening to Hannah. Hannah was nowhere to be found for the rest of the day, but we just assumed she was with the counselors. By nighttime, it was only me, Lucy, and Chloe settling into our cabin. I later found out that she was sent home early. To this day, I still have no idea, and it's one of the many reasons I'm never going back.